So welcome everybody. Time to start. So welcome to the next webinar in our row. So today we want to tackle connectors, data, scripting, templating, and all these topics. We already had the task list and CMMN last week, and we will have a performance webinar tomorrow. Maybe as a short side remark, we will send out the recording of the session and the slides afterwards, so you will get them. And anything else? Yeah, we will have a Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, just post them in the chat, even if while we are doing the webinar. And at the end, I will basically grab all the questions and do a Q&A session at the end and answer hopefully all of them. We have quite some time for the Q&A, so if you have any questions, just type them in the chat. Okay, perfect. So I will share my screen so you can see something. I'm basically doing a lot of demo today, so that's why I'm not just using slides. Yeah, my name is Bernd Rücker. I'm one of the two founders of Camunda. I have a quite long experience with workflow, especially open source engines in the Java field, and did a lot of projects with that. And currently, I'm in my role. I'm basically kind of an evangelist. Yeah, giving a lot of talks, giving a lot of presentations and webinars, and but I'm still doing quite some consultancy. So I'm basically doing a lot of proof of concept customers to basically to feel what really works out there, where the problems are, and how could we improve the product in order to help the people out there. If you want to reach out to me, just send me an email, or you can find me on Twitter. Yeah, that's basically me. So I'm giving the webinar today. We don't have co-moderation. Tomorrow, maybe that's interesting if you want to experience Daniel, our technical project lead, in action. The webinar tomorrow will be the best place to do that, because there he will talk about figures and benchmarks and all these kind of things. But for today, we want to talk about basically data. So what kind of process variables can we have? How do we store them in the database? How can we do data transformation in order to, for example, call a connector, which is another topic of today. So how can I call other systems via predefined connectors or reusable connectors? How do I do the data transformation in order to do an input mapping or an output mapping? How can I leverage templating mechanisms of the Java world in order to achieve that easily? How can I use scripting, basically script engines? If I either don't want to use or maybe quite handy in some situations to use scripting. Okay. About today is basically the Camunda BPM 7.2 version. So we released quite a lot of features around these topics. So it's basically one block which really belongs together. We introduced with 7.2. So it's basically all new what I showed today. Okay. With new features, it's always for us always interesting to get feedback, and there might be small issues with it where we maybe didn't do what you think we should do, or maybe there are a couple of missing features. And for us, really, it's really helpful if you give us feedback for that. So if you see anything today where you say, okay, that's great, but if you do it a tiny bit different, or there's a small additional feature that would be more valuable, just send them an email or go in the forum and give us feedback. I want to basically show one example today. So that's the process I basically developed for today's webinar. It's a small process from the business content. It's maybe a bit of nonsense, but it's always a problem. If you want to show technical features, it's hard to make it up a good business example, which is not too strange. So what I do today is what I call supplier onboarding. As a company, you might have suppliers sending you stuff, and you want to onboard them. And then if you have a new supplier, or from the view of accounting, that's a creditor, he applies, so then a process instance is kicked off, And then I go through a couple of service tasks. And basically, the first is to retrieve some data about his bank account. I basically search for a freely available SOAP web service in the internet, and that's basically what I came up with. It's basically a German service, so that's even not that nice for the international people. But there are actually not that much really cool free SOAP web services in the web, so that's why I've chosen that one. So I retrieve some bank data. Then I'm basically calculating some rating, which basically means I call Java code because I want to show that as well. Then I have a user task to approve the creditor. I basically show the information I collected here. Then he is approved or not. If he's approved, I basically store it, the creditor as an XML file in some real file. So in a drop folder. For the example is that this gets picked up by some web shop in order to process the creditor in some backend system, which is still true for a lot of customers I know. So I thought that might be a nice example. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to create my own connector, and I implemented a file connector in order to achieve that. So that's something we want to see later on. And if it's not approved, I send an email to the creditor with the rejection data. And I used a Groovy Script in order to do that. Okay, that could have been done in Java easily as well, but I used Groovy in order to show it basically and to show the advantages and disadvantages. And for the whole process instance, I have one process variable, where I store the application object. And this is a true Java class, a true object. So it's really an application with a couple of attributes. We will see that in a minute. Okay, so this is our process. Like I said earlier, I basically included a lot of different things in order to show the features of the platform. So I call it SOAP web service. Therefore, I use basically a template in order to create the SOAP body, which then I send via the connector to the web service. Then I get a response back, and then I use scripting in order to read data from the response. I use Java object as the creditor application. I basically want to store that as a JSON in the process, and then I reuse that as a Java object in my Java code. And then I want to reuse that as well, or want to get this and read it and change it in my HTML form of the task list, which again means I need JSON for that. Okay. So we see a couple of transformations there. Then I use what I said. I build a file connector myself and store an XML file there. By the way, then I transform the JSON Java object into an XML. And we have the scripting. And by the way, I use this template in order to create the email content. Okay. That's the plan for today, basically. Before I go into that example, I wanted to briefly highlight what we did in the 7.2 to give you some background what I'm talking about. So the first thing we worked on is the data for what I call data format support. So up to 7.1, when you created a process variable, that basically means that what either a primitive data type, so a long or a Boolean or a string that was stored to separate columns in the database, that was easy. But when it was a real object, it was the only possibility was to either serialize it as byte array or to do something custom. So basically to program the serialization yourself. Okay. And what we added is that we can serialize process variables as XML or JSON to the database. So that's done transparently in the background. We can do all the transformation between the formats transparently as well. So when you have a process variable like this application, you can always say, give me that as a JSON or give it to me as an XML. And then we will basically do the transformation in the background. So you don't have to care about that. So basically there are two big advantages you have. So the first is you can really use Java objects, or let's say objects, can be JSON as well, in your process variables. And you don't have to have byte arrays in the database. That was a pain in the 7.2 release, 7.1 release and the former releases, that you always have byte arrays in the database if you use objects. Because that has a lot of problems, like you cannot easily read them from the database. Your DBA might not be able to look into them. You cannot change them. If you change anything in the class, in the Java class, you might get deserialization problems. So there's really a big bunch of problems which you might get if you use that. So this is a preferable choice. And with all the transformation being possible in the background, that reduces the code you have to write in order to do the transformation by a big chunk. So that's much easier, much faster to write applications using different data formats. For scripting, what we did is that the first thing is, but that was true with the former release as well, we can use every JSR 223 compliant scripting engine. Okay, it just have to be on the class path, then we can use it. We ourselves test with Groovy, JavaScript, JSON, and JRuby, so there's kind of a guarantee that this really works, but every JSR compliant engine should do. Okay, but actually Groovy and maybe JavaScript are the most important from my point of view. So what I see at the customers is either Groovy or JavaScript, and I think it's still 80% is Groovy. That might change over time, but both work fine. Okay. But what we changed is that now you can use scripts basically everywhere. In the earlier releases, you could use scripts for script tasks. Now you can use scripts in listeners and other places. I will show you that on a slide in a minute. And another thing, we will see that in the demo, which is really cool. You can now externalize the script sources. So the first thing you can do with scripts is you can just write the script as the script source code within your BPMN XML file. I show you that in the example as well. And then it's deployed in the database with the BPMN file. It's executed and all that thing. But you can also write your script in a separate file. And this gets loaded during runtime. That means basically that you can use the IDE tooling for that script language, right? So if you write Groovy, you write it with your Groovy editor, so you get code completion and all these nice little features of an IDE. So you don't have to type that into a small text box. You have an hour to. So as soon as you write more and more scripts, or then it's really advisable to use external files, which you can edit in the editor of your choice. It's still possible technically to version that together with the BPMN file, but it's not done out of the box. So that's something you have to decide. And what we also did is we improved the performance of scripting by basically enabling what we now call compile and cache. So if the script engine supports to pre-compile the scripts, what we do is the first time we need it, we compile it, and then we cache the compiled script. So we don't have to compile it all the time. We just compile it once, and that's basically part of the process definition. So it's you don't have a lot of compile steps, and then you just reuse it with every process instance. So it's really fast. And I mean, the Java environment, Java 8 and Project Nashorn and all these things improved scripting performance as well. So it's not a big performance issue to use scripts anymore. Okay. So there were a lot of things we added, and I put it on the same slide because what we basically did, we added templating to the engine. So we basically used a backdoor for that. So what we did is we registered the templating engines, Freemarker and Velocity, as script engines. So we basically implemented a small layer which basically tells the JVM, okay, I'm a JSR 223 compliant scripting engine, which is Freemarker. and give it a name and these kind of things. And this thin layer allows us to use templates. So it's language. You don't use Groovy, use FreeMarket. And that allows us to reuse all the stuff we have here with the templates as well. Okay. We added XSLT as well, but that's in the Enterprise Edition only. So in the Community Edition, we have FreeMarket and Velocity. And this really makes, basically data transformation much easier. We will see that later on. So the way we build, we call web services to build the SOAP request with a template and then send it basically via HTTP to the web service. What we do not have to do is to include whatever pretty complex web service stack, which is maybe different on every application server and which might be in a version which doesn't fit your requirements. So if you, for example, use WS Trust or WS Security or some other things of the WS of the web service standards, it's not always easy to get that working with a web service implementation we have chosen. So what we do is we try to abstract from that as much as possible, which basically means you create the whole SOAP request yourself and then you send it over HTTP. And that makes it possible to basically run in every environment and to tackle every requirement there. And that's why templating for us was so important for adding that in 7.2. And the last thing we added, I already mentioned that now, are connectors. So connectors are basically small reusable components you can build, basically with a defined I/O mapping. So you can define what you have as a request and as a response, input and output. I/O is for input-output mapping. And you build that or something we already pre-built, or maybe the community is starting to build connectors. Then you just configure them within your BPMN process model. Okay, so you have your BPMN process model, you just have a service task, you drag in the connector, and then it can configure it. It's normally used for service calls. That makes sense, right? For us, it's currently possible to be synchronous, or if you're asynchronous, you're basically synchronous without a response. And what we ship out of the box are SOAP addressed connectors, which basically are based on the Apache. What I said earlier, it's basically Apache HTTP client. So there's no special SOAP framework involved, which makes it much more flexible to use for you later. Okay. Wait a second. Perfect. I promised that I have a slide where you can use scripts and templates. As you remember, templates are scripts, so I can use script tasks, I can have listeners, I can have conditions where I use scripts. Okay, that's new, for example. I could have only expression language earlier, now I can have scripts. And if I use connectors within service tasks, you can use scripts and templates for input and output mapping. And we have the connectors on service tasks. I think that makes pretty much sense. So that was, basically I wanted to get you on ground in the 7.2. Now we want to get into more detail. So basically now we iterate again over all the stuff and we see it in action. The first thing I wanted to stress is the variable serialization. So as soon as I have a variable like the creditor application process variable in my process instance, when the process instance is stored to the database, what we need to do is we serialize the data into a format we can store in the database. Okay, that's what I mentioned earlier. I already mentioned that in the past, we always serialized as a byte array, which, by the way, is still the default. So if you have a Java object, it's serialized as a byte array because we don't want to change the default. The default is still having a byte array. But you can change the default, and you can change for every variable in which format it should be serialized. So now you can do it as a JSON or XML. Yeah, so let's see that in action. I think that's much more interesting than having slides. So where is it? This is my object. Okay, it's a creditor application object with a couple of attributes. There's nothing special in it. It's serializable because I want to show you the old and new way. Yeah, that's it. So a pretty plain old Java object at Pojo. What I can do now, I prepared a JUnit test. So in that test, I create a new application. I start a process instance. I hand over process variables, which is a hash map. You might remember that from the old version. What I use, that's the only thing which is different. I use that variables class, which is new in 7.2, which has some convenience methods in order to create a variable map, which is basically still a hash map. Okay. So there's nothing, I come to it why it's a variable map in a minute, but it could be just a map string object, right? So there's nothing special about that. Then I start the process instance. And what I want to do is I want to inspect the database afterwards to see the variable stored in the database. And the way I have chosen to do that is actually to set a breakpoint here. This is not used, right? Yeah, that's why I don't see my breakpoint. So I have a breakpoint here, and what I used in the JUnit test, which is the default for us, is that we always use H2, an in-memory H2 database. And the cool thing about H2 is that it can do a lot of stuff with it. For example, we can start a TCP server from that in-memory engine in order to be accessible from the outside. So we can, with a normal SQL tool, we can now see the database. You could start a web server as well. Then you can access it via your browser. Okay, but I like that more for the moment. So what I can do now, I just debug that one. Debug it. So now it gets started. Yeah, I know what I did. I basically haven't yet implemented that service task because we want to do that in a minute. Wait a second. So what I always do if I need to get something working quickly, I just assign some logger delegate. So that service task is implemented now. So my JUnit test should run fine. Yeah, perfect. So now what I can do is I use the database tool, whatever you like. You could use Squirrel, SQL, or what I like is actually the DB visualizer. It's not open source, so it's maybe not available to you, but it's a really cool tool. And I connect to that server now. So I see the database, which is used in my JUnit test. So for example, what I can do here is I can have a look at my process variables. So what I see is I see my application, which is serializable, and that, for example, changed. That was not true in 7.1, but now we add the information about the Java class we use there. And what you can see is you can see that reference is a byte array. Okay, and now we have a look at the byte array table. B5. So this is the object. If I look into it, you see that an object tree, which basically means array. What DB Visualizer can do is actually it can inspect it. Okay, it's basically completely generic, so it's inspecting it without knowing the class, which is pretty cool actually that this is doable, but most of the tools cannot do that. So what you normally would see is some kind of byte array. Okay, so that's the default. What we can do now, and that's what I want to show you quickly, is, and that's why I use that variables here, is you can use a different construct now, which is called, we called it value typed actually. We always, we added it to the end to have the same method, but having something as a suffix, so it's value typed, which basically means I just do not only hand over the object, but now I can use that class in order to create a so-called object value. So I say I have an object value of kind of this value, and then I can specify the serialization data format. So as an additional information, I tell them, okay, please serialize that as a JSON, or maybe if you prefer as an XML. Okay. I just told him that for this one specific process variable, so I might still see that one just to see the difference. And again, I debug that. So I have to reconnect and refresh. So I have my application, which now is an XML file. Okay, and yeah, the application tool is still binary. Okay, can do the same stuff with the now, but maybe that's not that interesting. But so that's basically a new API we provide, which is actually pretty cool. I think that's easy to read, right? And there you can already do a lot of things with it. But if you want to keep your applications like they are, or if you just say, okay, I want to store all objects as a JSON because a byte array doesn't make sense, which I would agree actually on, then you can change your configuration of your process engine. So what I use here, maybe just to show you that, I use the configuration for my test engine. So what I can do here is I can set the default serialization format to, for example, application JSON or application XML. So as soon as I do that, I go back to my test. Now I just have the put value again, not this thing here, and I debug it. Just that again. Again, I stop and I have to reconnect and my byte array. So again, this, yeah, and this time I get the variable as a JSON. Okay, so that's the first thing. You can really influence how the variable is stored. And what you already see in the background is that we do all the transformation ourselves from Java object to JSON to XML. So that's really done in the background. With that in mind, so that was basically the ground base. So I know when I want to use a JSON serialization format of the application, the demo, and now we really want to build that process. So actually, what I want to do first, and that's something we now do together live. That's why the service task was not implemented. We can together with you and basically showing you the a good day in order to get started here. So I want to build the best using Freemarker, because that's actually the easiest way of doing it. If we have time left, which I don't think so, we could do the same as XSLT. Maybe we just have a look at that because I have prepared that. So you can basically choose if you want to use Freemarker or XSLT. That basically depends on how complex your transformation is. So sometimes Freemarker, sometimes XSLT is a better tool of choice. Then we want to use the SOAP connector. And then when we get the response, we use the XPath in order to get some, to extract some data from the response, because then XPath is pretty straightforward with XML. And then I have basically the bank name extracted, and I want to set that attribute within my JSON object, and that's something I do using a Javascript script. Okay. The other things in that process are already implemented. So there we only have a look of what we are doing. Okay. Yeah, I think I already mentioned a lot of that, so we just go through it. And we referenced that slide during the demo a couple of times. What is interesting? Yeah, we see that in a minute. Right. So let's do that. I remove my debug stuff. I basically, no, in the end I had JSON, right? Yes, so that's all I need. I want to have JSON. These test cases are already working actually, so we can check afterwards with the test cases if we implemented the right thing. So it's basically a test first approach where I already did the test before the webinar, and now we want to implement the SOAP web service. Okay, the first thing I do is I remove that Java class because we don't need that. We want to use a connector. In order to get started, it's always recommended to basically check the user guide. So there you find a whole chapter about connectors as soon as my internet loads it. So there are connectors. You get a lot of information about the connectors, how to configure them, how to use them. So that's an XML request. And that's always cool. There are a lot of examples available in our GitHub examples repository. So for example, for service task, we have a SOAP service task example, where you get all the information basically as well. So that's a good thing in order to get started. So I don't want to dive into all the details, but what I do now is I really call the SOAP web service. What I said earlier, I used in German it's called Bankleitzahl. It's basically the bank ID number. Okay, and there's a web service available which can query the bank name for a bank ID number. And this is something I use. Okay, so I have a whistle for my service. And as soon as I say web service, I normally use SOAP UI sooner or later, always. So what I can do, I can load the whistle into SOAP UI. So I get a service called get bank. I get in the bank account ID. I just know some in my head. Post the request, and what I get back is that this is the name of the bank institute. So that's a German bank. Okay, and some other IDs and the location. So this is located in Berlin, and so on and so on. Okay, so that's a typical SOAP request, right? And from the actually that was interesting when we thought about implementing connectors. What I did for quite a while is basically to watch people connecting to SOAP web services, even maybe with other tools or with other BPM stacks, because we have a couple of projects where we replace other BPM stacks, even the big ones, and then you can have a look at people working with it. And it's interesting because in I would say 80 to 90% of the cases, the people open SOAP UI if they work with web services because they want to test how. It's really easy to get a new request. You can have mocking and testing. So SOAP UI is really a sophisticated tool for that. And then you basically have a request, an example request to get started. And the interesting thing is now, if we use the SOAP connector, which is the actually referenced here, using connectors. No, it's not referenced here. Then what you can do is you can have a look at the basis for our connectors, the Camunda Connect project. So that's again a separate GitHub project, and there you can see the connectors, and you're basically pointing to the connector reference. That's actually what I'm missing in the other documentation. So there you have a list of the connectors. You can see how the SOAP connector is working, and so on and so on. For the moment, I just tell you how it works basically. So what I do in my service task, I add a connector. The connector is called SOAP HTTP connector. Connector has a couple of inputs and outputs. quickest way actually to find that is always with an example. So you could check that one where it invokes the web servers, and then you can see, okay, there's a SOAP HTTP connector, it has an URL, payload, and some headers. Okay, and that's what I wanted to hand in here as well, so I can add a URL. The URL is basically something I get from my WSDL. Where was it? Sorry if I'm switching Windows a bit quickly, but that's the URL of my service. If this is dependent on the stage, like a test environment or production environment, you can use expression language in order to read that from a property service, which might get it differently on every stage system. Okay, so this is the URL. And then what else did we have? We had a header or headers. Headers were a map. And there's one header entry, which is called content type. Okay. So again, there we can copy and paste a lot of things. So what we say, it's an application of XML, it's UTF-8, that makes sense. And we have to provide the action. So the action is obviously different. So if we go to the get bank, we see that's the operation. So get bank is the action. But obviously we have to use, we're an XML and SOAP, so we have to use the right namespace. So I use that namespace and the get bank. Right. So that's the action. Okay. So that's my header. And what else do I have to provide? I have to provide actually the payload I want to send, right? So I want to have the payload, and now that's what I meant earlier. Now I can use script at all points in my process, in this case in my input mapping. And now I say basically with script language I want to have, and in my case I use Freemarker, which is a template engine, but I can use it as a script. And now I can provide the FreeMarket template. And if you know Freemarker is pretty cool because you can now post basically the SOAP message you want to have. And now I can use the kind of expression language for FreeMarker. And what we did is we basically map all the variables we have into the context of the templating engine or the script engine. So we can always access process variables like our application. And this application has a attribute which is called bank identifier code, I think. We check that in a minute. Okay, so that's it. Now I create my body, my payload. And that should be it actually. We just check if we did that right. Bank identifier code. Okay, that's perfect. Then we can do an output mapping, and the output mapping basically means that we extract the bank name from the response so we get that response, and we want to have this is the bank name. Okay, so this and so-called Bezeichnung, which is basically the description, the name of the bank. I want to do that via XPath, and actually because I wanted to save a bit of a time, I made me a copy and paste thing for that one. I hope you don't mind. So then we have more time to explain actually. So what I do now, that's pretty cool. I use expression language. Now I use something what we call Camunda Spin. And let me make a quick round to the docs again. So there's a so-called Spin Data Format API reference guide, which is pretty handy. And there is a so-called, let's go to GitHub, Camunda Spin. So that's basically a small library we added with the 7.2 release. So yeah, it's already saying what it is. So it's a library for simple XML and JSON processing on the JVM. And what you can already see is that it's easy to work with the XML and JSON within Spin. So for example, if you have some string or input stream with an XML, you can always write, okay, this is an XML, then you get an object from Spin, and then you can access the XML via Fluent API. So get me all the customers, get me the first one, get me the attribute ID, and get me the value. Okay, that could be something I can do with it. And what you can also do with it, so we have that here. If you read through it, there's a lot more. For example, if you have an XML as a string, you can directly read that as an XML. So then it's transformed from string to XML. And the same as XML with a string is S. S is for Spin. So we normally use always the S. And you can provide the format this is in. So if you provide a JSON, you write a JSON, or if you provide an XML, you write XML. If you are in an expression language, you can use this one. If you're in a script language, you always have to use the S. We haven't bound the XML to script languages because we had an overload with the XML, or we do the same JSON. And then we had basically clashes with the script engines itself, so we haven't done that, right? So you might have to write S and the XML here. So that's using here, I'm using Spin, and you can always use Spin in our engine now. Here I say, get me the response. The response is an XML. I actually don't have to care what this is exactly. So this is a string or some kind of object. I say I want to have that as an XML. And now please execute that XPath. So I basically go on all elements where the local name, because I have skipped the namespaces here. So the local name should be this Bezeichnung, which is that one here. If you're talking English the whole time and you say a couple of German words, you recognize why the people always think that's a hard language, Bezeichnung. But whatever, that's the name of the bank, and then I get the element, which basically means give me that element, and then I wanna have that as a text content. So basically, I get a string in bank name. Okay, that's what I do here, without writing any Java code. By the way, maybe that's an interesting hint. It might be that you think, oh, this is not an advantage, not writing Java code. So if you want to write that in Java code, you can basically leverage the same stuff in Java. So you can write a Java delegate and still using Spin, using that Fluent API I showed you earlier. So then this is still valuable because it saves you a lot of hassle of creating an XML, Googling how XPath works on that, these kind of things. Okay. Right. So I have that Bezeichnung remembered in bank name as a process as an variable. So that's the output parameter. But now what I want to do, I want to basically write the bank name into the application object. So what I can do is I configure the output parameter of the connector. But what I can do as well, I can configure input-output parameters for the whole service task. Okay, so that can be handy in order to map process variables into the service task or outside of it. You can use that, by the way, for user tasks as well. So if you want to have some special variables only for a form in the put on user task as well. But for the moment, I use it here, and then I can do an output parameter where I say, again, I want to have the bank name, but this time it's a script. I use JavaScript and say, okay, please change my application object. That's the bank name. And again, you could use a script resource file and then use an editor where you have code completion available. It doesn't make sense for one line of code in my case, but you could easily do that. And I assign the bank name I got from my connector in the output mapping. And what I do is, that might be a bit strange, but the last the last object I have here is basically used as a return value, now set as a variable bank name. That's because every template or script must have a return value at the moment if you use it as an output parameter. We're still discussing if that has to be the case, but at the moment it's like that. If I want to do that, by the way, I could use an listener as well, right? I could use an listener on the exit of the service task, which might be a bit more logical in that way. But for this webinar, I wanted to show input-output mapping, so that's why I use that. Okay, so that's it. Now we should be able to call that web service. And what I quickly wanted to do is I want to run a unit test in order to see if that really works. Which it does, where you don't see a lot of things at the moment, but you see the green bar. So maybe show you that I was not that lazy. So I basically wrote a test for the approved and rejection path. If you are interested in the test case, you can have a look at in the source code of that application. It's available in GitHub. And over the link with the webinar recording. So in our consulting repository, I uploaded one-time examples, the webinars. So there's our data connector script source code available as well. Maybe I post it in the chat so you have that available immediately. So there you can see the whole test case. What I want to do for now is I want to deploy that on my Camunda installation here. So what I'm using is our distribution at 7.2. Wait a second, something is wrong here. Yeah, 7.2.1 EE. You can use the latest community edition as well. It's an empty engine, so I haven't anything deployed yet, and I just want to deploy that process application. So together with that BPMN process, I having a couple of other things which I show in a minute. So as soon as I deployed the one, I have my process definition deployed. That makes sense, and I can use, for example, a task list in order to start my process instance. What I did here, I don't want to go into details of that because I did that in the last week's webinar of the task list, and there's a recording available for that as well if you want to dive more into forums. But what I did is I provided a start form here, which basically creates my application object, and that's basically the same what I did earlier in the test case. I provide the format which it should be serialized with. Maybe to make that short now, what I can do is I can easily create the JSON object in the user interface form. So I want to have Camunda registered and my email address. I have a bank account number. I don't want to provide our bank account. The one I remembered. Or we can use a real one actually from Camunda. I have that in the test case. That's our bank account in Germany. That's the identifier code of the bank. So I start my process, and yeah, there's actually a nice feature you can see from the task list. So now I'm, as a demo user, have the approved creditor task as a next step immediately, which is the case here because the demo is a bit strange, right? Because I'm not doing a lot of things in the process. But what you can see is that I moved on. I called the SOAP web service, which seemed to work. We didn't get any error. We calculate the rating. We look at that in a minute. And we are now in the approved creditor user task. If I look at the form, what you can see is that we now got the bank name, right? So that was filled in correctly, which is pretty cool actually. So because it was not a hard work, right, to call the web service. Right. So far, so good, I think. So what else can we have a look at the process? So after I called the SOAP web service, I called Java code. So my calculating rating delegate. That's the typical, let's say, old way of doing it, which I think is still 99% of the cases at the moment, but it's there, right? Can call it Java delegate. And the interesting thing now is that if I say execution get variable, I get a Java object. Even if in this case of the task list, I created a JSON in the front end and I handed the JSON over to the back end, I just get a Java object here automatically. We can even go one step further, which is interesting. I can do the same via the REST API. So if you have, and we had use cases in the past, and we will have them more in the future, where we have, for example, PHP front ends, so or maybe HTML5 front ends. So what I mean is not Java-based front ends, and they use normally the REST API in order to communicate with the engine. And there I can use the this URL, this REST resource for that process. I want to call the start method. So I start a new process instance. I post some data, which is basically, maybe we can make that a bit nicer. Can format that in a nice way. So I want to hand over process variables, and then I can hand over the application. And again, I provide some data. And again, the same as in Java, I say that's an object, but it's serialized as JSON. Okay. And I provide the JSON and I send it. In the background, everything is fine. I got a okay. So if I again look in my task list, I should have a second approved creditor with the data I provided now. Okay, so that's really done transparently in the background. We added some API in order to work with that variables. I mentioned that earlier. At a lot of places, you can just add typed as a suffix. So if I get the application in that typed way, what I get is a typed value. We call it typed value. And in this case, I know this should be an object. Doesn't have to be an object. Actually, it might be, if I have other, whatever, maybe too much for the moment. So in this case, it's an object. And then you can ask different questions to that type value. So you can say, hey, give me the type, right? This should be an object. Give me the value, which should basically be the Java object. But you can also say, give me the serialization format and give me the serialized value, which should be a JSON. So if I look in my console, you'll see that this out here, the logging. Okay, so the type variable, type object, that's the toString of the object, it's in JSON, and I have the JSON representation. So that makes it much easier to work with all the data. When you do task queries, you can basically hand in, so let's maybe quickly do that. I hope that's not too much at once, but if I do a task query, what you can always do is, where is that? Just have to remember how it was named. Where is that? Can basically, I think I was too quick now in scrolling. I think it might be in the REST API. Yeah, whatever. What you can do I think it's in the REST API, because that's what the task list is doing. It basically specifies if you deserialize the variables when loading it or not. So you can just load the serialized value of it. So and that helps if you don't have the Java class and the class path, you can still access variables in the serialized format. That's what I wanted to say here. Okay, so that was the Java delegate. Then I have the user form. Again, I have some HTML form where I really fetch that variable. I have it as a JSON. I bind it to the Angular scope. Again, I do that very quick because it was in the last week's webinar. You can see it there if you're interested. And then I can just bind my user form fields to that JSON object. Okay, so that works pretty well here. Okay, the condition language, the expression language on the condition, I'm still doing Joule, Java Unified Expression Language. I could do something else here as well, like scripting, right? And the script has to provide true or false. But what I do is still plain old, good old Joule. Maybe the email rejection script. I just provided a Groovy Script. That's actually a good example that I could have done in Java, in a Java Delegate. Very good, because I'm just using comments email, creating the email. Yeah, basically sending the email, right? And I'm setting the mail text via an input mapping. I'll show you that in a minute. The interesting thing here is that you can think about when it makes sense to use a script or a Java Delegate. So the big difference is what I did here is that the script is part of the BPMN file, of the XML file. So I don't have to deploy Java code, okay, which might allow me to have a different deployment cycle. So it might not be that I use what I did here, like a war deployment or jar deployment. It might be that I have a deploy button on some web interface, just uploading an XML and that's it. So that allows a couple of new use cases here. And it's versioned together with process definition in the database. That might be an advantage if you want to have it versioned. It might be a disadvantage if you want to fix a bug in there. So it just has consequences, and it's important to think about that. Okay, that's the Groovy Script, and what I said earlier, the mail text as an input parameter is a FreeMarket template, which I referenced in the file, so I'm getting a bit quicker now. And again, that FreeMarket access variable here did not really sophisticated stuff, but FreeMarket can do a lot. It has loops, it has conditions, if and else, and so it really can do a lot. It can do a lot in FreeMarket. Okay. That's this. And the last thing I wanted to show you in the demo is that I stored a file via the file connector. And if you look at the documentation, there is no file connector available in Camunda. So what I did is I built my own connector. I actually did that in order to show you how easy it is to build a connector and what you have to do to build your own connector, because that's now a really cool place where the community can jump in and build connectors as community extensions and share them among the community. For us, the important or the difficult decision is always what connectors we include in the supported product. Then it's supported, and we give a lot of guarantees for that we support it over time, that we that it runs on every environment, on every application server, different database and Java version or whatever. But if it's a community extension, it's much easier to share. And it's pretty easy to build actually. So what I did is I did a file connector, which gets an ID. So that's a name, and I have to have a provider, which is actually a very easy one, but in order to use that Java mechanism to auto-load the connector. So that's a cool thing. If you build a connector, you just have to put it on the class path of the engine, and then it's available. Okay, so you don't have to register it, configure it, very complex. You just have to add it to the class path, then it's there. And you have to basically create a request and response. You saw that the interfaces I have are really, really small here. And the implementation is basically small as well. So the provider gives back the connector impl, and the connector impl now really executes the behavior. So I have an execute. I can get information from the request. So in my case, I said, okay, please provide me with a file path and the file content. And then, yeah, you see that was pretty hacky way of doing it. So don't use that in production, please. But I just wrote the content to a file. Okay. Not very sophisticated. And then I return an empty response because I don't need a response. Okay, so that's actually pretty easy to write. As soon as I have that, what I did is I added to my dependencies. So I have the file connector edited to my main dependency, so I can use it in my process. Just to make that quickly, you see the connector. So I use the file connector. I say the file path, please store it on my D drive. Very sophisticated here. And I have my file content where I say, okay, I want to have the application, which was, you remember it, it's a JSON object, but it's also a Java object. And I want to have it as an XML stored in that file. Okay, so what we can quickly do is we can check on my D drive. Let's check that. So there's an old webinar. I delete that. And as soon as I approve that one, complete that, I should have a new webinar file, right? Exactly from now. And if I have a look at that one, it's an XML representation of my creditor. Okay, so that works actually. Cool, right? Just a quick way of writing a connector and storing as a file. So that's quite an extensive demo. I hope that was somehow understandable what I did. Okay, it was not too quick, and you got the idea. And what I try to do is really do it on a hands-on example to show you the different things, what you can do with that infrastructure. It's a different question of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So I wouldn't use a Groovy Script for sending the email here normally. In production, I use a Java Delegate. Okay. But that depends, right? And I have a couple of ramp-up slides in order to discuss that. Yeah, I have the links to spin and connect on the slides. We already had a look at them. And yeah, I think that's actually really awesome what we have built there in the 7.2 release. And this was steered by a couple of customer projects. So there was especially one really big project at a customer we work very closely together with in order to build that. So we always try to work together with customers to build something that people really need. But I want to give you some background why we did it in that way we did it. And the first thing which is important to remember, and I'm not sure if everybody knows that, but there's a really good white paper available from Sandy Kemsley. Sandy Kemsley from Canada. She's an analyst and blogger. She blogs a lot, and she wrote a webinar about developer-friendly business process management. And basically the core message of that is that what a lot of the vendors do are zero-code BPM suites. So zero code means you don't have to write code, and the idea is always that you get rid of your developers, and the business folks can implement process applications, can implement processes because there's no code involved, right? You just click it together. And this is an approach which we think that doesn't work, right? Because if you're calling a web service, if you're calling a SOAP web service, there is some complexity involved. Okay, and if you use WS security, for example, it's really complex, and this is not that easy to click together. And doing all the transformation, getting the idea how that belongs together, which data I need where, and there's a lot of things you have to think about. And this is normally always too complex for business folks, and by nature. And then what happens is that the zero code tools are normally handed over to developers because they are trained in doing this kind of work. And then they have to work with this zero code suites, which basically means they have to use a completely different IDE and development approach they know, because this is highly proprietary. And she basically points that, or she phrases it that if you use these zero code suites, they are basically your IDE of the whole company. So it's an enterprise IDE. So you basically exchange your Java development stack with the proprietary BPM suite. If you want to do this, that's fine, but you should be aware that it's really a development environment, because it's still, I mean, that's why I don't like the zero code name. It's still code, right? If you stick it together, it's some kind of code. And what we experience project is that it's much more efficient if the developers write the code in the way they know. So what we try to do is to make the life of the developer easy and more productive. You might call it less code. So what we did with Spin is allowing to have XML transformations, for example, to be done much easier without all the hassle sometimes necessary in Java. Or we have developers not speaking Java, like PHP front-end developers, or more and more maybe even Groovy guys or HTML files guys. So the world is getting more and more polyglot. Even if you're using the JVM, the language might be different in future. So we prepare the platform for that, and we allow for a couple of new use cases with the features we implemented there. But we don't aim to be a zero code suite for empowering the business analyst to click together complex integration scenarios. It just doesn't work. So what we always do is, what I said earlier, you can extract for example, the script in order to use your editor, or you can always extend the mechanisms we use there. You can use a connector within your Java Delegate. So you don't have to use the connector within the BPMN file. You can just leverage the connector within Java if that's more convenient for you. So we always try to keep that really what we call developer friendly. If you're still in the hassle of discussing internally, if you use the zero code suite, or if you use, for example, Camunda, it's always recommended to use to read the white paper, and you might want to pass that around in your company, because it's a really good one, and it really has a good summary of that. But for the new use cases, we now allow with what we did there, despite that you might save work as a developer, are basically the two I name here. So the first thing is what we have at various customers is that they building some kind of zero code solution in a limited domain for a known customer set. So for example, we have IT divisions that want to basically provide an infrastructure for internal other departments and other teams to work with. And then they might say, okay, for example, we're a telecommunication company, and we just have these kind of service tasks. And now you can build processes with that. So you limit the domain, and then it's much easier to make a generic reusable zero code solution. And this in that limited domain, that works. And the other example where this is true is if you're a software vendor, you might want to make the processes you deliver with the software you ship customizable. And then you just have a limited set of service tasks or connectors you ship with your standard default processes, and that might be customizable. And for both of these, we can prepare that in a correct way. We need developers in order to work together on the customer. And that works. We see that in the project. But what is really a little domain is that to really put some effort in providing the infrastructure. And, for example, our Camunda modeler can be extended or have own elements on the palette. So, for example, you can have like your own whatever SAP service task here directly connected to a connector and these kind of things. And that's possible, but it's quite some effort to build. Okay. By the way, we're currently building with BPMN IO. We're building a web-based modeler, and these kind of things will be possible with the web-based modeler sometime in the future as well. Okay. The other use case you can tackle with that is basically a customer framed that term, and we took that. It's called classless deployment. So if you don't need Java code deployments, which might mean that you just deploy an XML file, so that can be easily uploaded via web page or these kind of things. And what I mentioned earlier, you can deploy scripts together with the XML file. There are different motivations actually in order to do that. We have customers where that really makes sense because they have really a huge load on the servers and a lot of processes, and they want to exchange just one process very, very quickly, and then this is nice and handy. We have other projects where basically this mechanism is used in order to avoid the methodology, the processes you should use for deployment. So like staging and going through a QA and having some release notes and these kind of things. So that for a lot of customers, that takes like days to weeks in order to release an enterprise application internally. So they try to find a way around that. That's a way around it, but I'm not a bigger fan of that idea, because then you normally should try to adjust your internal processes in order to deploy correctly, because that means that you basically skip all the testing and these kind of things, which doesn't make a lot of sense for most of the applications I know. But these are use cases to take a look at. What I you have features much more for that. Recently, which now actually it's hard to do like we had a process application deployed on the Camunda engine, in this case a JBoss application server. We had an ESB running, an enterprise service bus, and in that example it was Talent on a Carafe, so an OSGI environment, but it actually doesn't matter. It could be an IBM ESB, or it could be a Mule, or it could be just Camel installation or whatever. It actually doesn't matter. So we talked SOAP to that one, it talked REST to us, and we had the PHP front end talking REST to us as well. And the big thing was that without the variable serialization we had, we always had byte arrays in the database. It was really hard to avoid, and this could be completely switched. And with all the environment for data transformation, this gets really handy to build now. And I think that's not that uncommon to have a bunch of front-end developers. Maybe you have your process application developers, and you have the service guys. Personally, I'm not a big fan of ESBs, but that's a completely different story. So we normally hook in what works at the customer. Okay. Yeah. So that's pretty cool. And as a quick summary, this is how we phrase it off now, that what we still phrase that developer friendliness. So even system integration can be done developer friendly. And if you look at all the big tools, the big vendor, what they do is what we call death by property panel. So all the connectors have like 40, 50, 60 properties, because they have to add everything in a property which you have to configure. Then you often have only a small text panel where you enter even some code, and you don't have the code completion, and all the things I mentioned earlier. And this is what we call death by property panel. And that doesn't make any sense, right? If it gets enter that in the property panel. And maybe as a side remark, I haven't shown that, but all the data I enter here is always available in the XML source, and you're free actually to adjust the XML source if you want to. So if you're quicker in writing the connector configuration as XML, or you want to copy and paste something from a demo, from an example, from your wiki page where you collect the different connector settings, it's pretty easy to do, right? So I can change anything here. I'm not forced to use our property panels or our tooling. That's what we call developer friendly. If you want to get more information, there's really a lot in the documentation. So we are really improved a lot in writing the docs for the features we implement. We're lacking still features implemented at the very beginning of the engine. We're trying to catch up, but for new features, we're really good in documenting them. So you find something on connectors, on scripting, on templating, on the data stuff. So there are all the links. I pointed you to the examples earlier already. I pointed to the example I did today. So there you should find a lot of things. We're still improving what we're doing there. So a lot of things were introduced too. I mentioned that. So it's pretty new, it's pretty fresh. We still have ideas how to improve that. For example, currently the spin stuff is not available in FreeMarket templates, which would be nice and handy. We want to have the output mapping where I use the JavaScript in order to write it to an object should be a step easier. And for XSLT, we have small improvements. We could think of a special data type for XML and JSON. So at the moment, I have a Java object serialized as JSON, but maybe I want to have a Java object of type JSON or XML. There we could make the implementation of it more efficient. It might be really cool for HTML5 to not have string for JSON, but JSON for JSON. We could think of the history, like an audit trail for connector IO. So you really see what flows into and out of a connector. We don't have that yet. We have it for input output of service tasks and process variables, but not for the connector. We're still not sure if we need that or if we do want that, but we are thinking of it. I have a separate slide on Workbench. And there is no completely fixed roadmap yet. So it's always for you if you're interested in that, or if you say, hey, I need that, otherwise that doesn't make any sense, or if you have completely different ideas, let us know. The forum is a good place, or if you're an enterprise customer, the support is a good channel, or send me an email or whatever channel you like. Just send us feedback. If you write your own connectors, let us know. We might even make them available in the community space. Yeah, so that could be pretty cool. And maybe as a last idea, before we go to the Q&A, what we built as kind of, it was during a couple of hack days, we developed what we call the Workbench. And this is now available on a GitHub repository. It's an HTML5 web application where you can directly load and see processes. You might model them in future when we are ready with our BPMN IO. You already can set a couple of variables. You can debug into your process applications. You can you have a console where you can access a lot of information, where you can basically test scripting and these kind of things. So basically, we're just one step away from having a complete IDE where you create the process, test the process, deploy the process, and this can work completely without Java code if you're in a script-only environment. And the cool thing about it is that if you have that, you still can download the BPMN XML and start a normal Java project from there. Because it will still work, and you can start adding Java code to it later on, and you can mix that perfectly. So it's not that we force you into that kind of zero code environment, but it's maybe something to play around with, to learn some of the concepts, or maybe for rapid prototyping. Yeah, but currently it's still a side project, so you might keep an eye on it, but it's nothing which is at the moment planned to be productized pretty soon. Yeah, but it's maybe interesting to check out. Okay, so that was it. We still have a couple of minutes for questions. I want to do one thing before I jump into the questions, which is actually running a quick poll. So for me, it would be interesting why you're attending the webinar. If you're already using these like scripts or templates or these kind of things. And so I would really appreciate if you can just take part in the poll. And in the meanwhile, I get started and sort out the questions. There were a couple of them actually. So the first question is quickly answered. So there was one. The video will be posted somewhere. And yes, the whole recording is available later on. You will get an email with a link. It will be on Vimeo actually. There was a question, what is the advantage of using Groovy over JavaScript? And actually a good question. I'm not completely sure if there's a big advantage actually. I mentioned that most of the people use Groovy instead of JavaScript. But I actually cannot tell you why. It's just what I see out there at the customers, and I think it's maybe a bit out of history because Groovy is the scripting engine on the JVM. So it's just used a lot out there. But I don't see any real advantage of the one over the other. So I would make one standard in my project or even in my company, use the one or the other. And that might depend on the knowledge of the people, on the experience you have. So, but I think it's not a big difference. But I might be wrong actually. I'm not the script expert. Okay. There's another question. Yeah. There was a question about my output mapping in the process. So when I did, this one. When I did the output mapping, I set the bank name on my application. And the question was, which format or which variable is used here? And in this case, it's the Java object, because what I said when I created the object earlier is that this is a creditor application. So always when I get the variable, it's always a Java object, unless I tell the engine to give me a different format, which I don't do here, right? So it's a Java object used in my JavaScript code base. Okay, I could do something like as application, and this might be JSON, for example, and then I might work on the JSON if I like. But if I don't say anything, in this case, it's a Java object. Okay. And the question was which language I use here, and that's actually JavaScript, but that's a good example of the difference, right? I could write Groovy, it's exactly the same code. Okay, so this case should still run. Not a big difference. Right, perfect. Okay, wait, hang on a second. I stopped the screen sharing, right? Guys. Sorry. It was about that script. This was, the Java object, because I haven't told him anything to do, and I showed the form where I created it. So this is the Java object. And what I changed now is I changed that from JavaScript to Groovy. So it doesn't matter actually, it's the same source code. Okay. Let me quickly check. What else do we have? There was some more questions. Yeah, there was a question how to use a script engine in the engine. So basically what you have to do in order to use script engine, and that's what I mentioned earlier, it basically has to be on the class path. So what you have to do in order to have it in the test cases, I have Groovy on my class path. Can I maybe have a look at here? So I have Groovy on my class path. I could have that actually in would be actually better in test scope. And what we have as well, so if I JBoss, for example, JBoss, we have the engine deployed as modules. So I can Camunda, BPM engine, main, there's my engine. What I have there, I have a couple of dependencies, and what you could do is, and what is done here, you add the script engine as dependencies to the engine, and then this is available within your processes. Okay. When we're already at that point, maybe one additional remark on the configuration of Camunda Spin and Camunda Connect. What you have to do in order that it's really running is you have to add a process engine plugin. Not sure if you're familiar with process engine plugins, but you can have process engine plugins which basically adjust the process engine configuration. And there's one plugin for Spin, which basically enables Spin, and one for Connect, which basically enables Connect. So only if these plugins are there, you can use Spin and you can use the connectors. You only need that plugin. Afterwards, the Connect plugin finds all the connectors again via this class path scanning mechanisms I showed earlier. But you have to have these two process engine plugins. They are by default enabled in the distributions we ship. So on Tomcat, on JBoss, on WebSphere, on WebLogic, they are there. You don't have to do anything there, but it's important to get that. So I think I make one last question and then I wrap it up. So if there are any more questions, I see two more actually, but just post them to the forum because I want to keep in time. There's one question: if we plan to have more connectors, and that's actually an interesting question, a tricky question, because don't know yet actually. We're checking what the people are doing with the connectors now, and we're checking if the community is building connectors, and then it might be that we add a couple of them or to the core product. It might be that we build something like the cockpit plugin store in order to manage community plugins. That might be sufficient. So it's actually not yet decided. So for the moment, we're really in a watch what the community is doing and the customers both. So if you have any cool connectors, let us know. If you have any demand for specific connectors, would be interesting to get a quick feedback as well. Okay, so I want to run actually one more poll. If you liked the webinar or not, be honest, I can take it. And I want to thank you for the time. I hope that was somehow interesting, or you got the idea. It was understandable what I wanted to show. And yeah, if you have any questions left, again, the forum, or you can basically download Camunda BPM, start with playing with the example now. You can always call us. You can give us feedback. Hope you have fun with that, and maybe see you tomorrow in the next webinar. And yeah, have a nice evening for my time zone, and maybe a nice day for other time zones. Thank you. Bye.